Okay, so if you've watched the first part of the Sensation and Perception video lecture, you have been introduced to the overview of what sensation is versus perception. You've been introduced to the idea of top-down and bottom-up processing, how they both work together, but how they sometimes lead us to have different interpretations of the world. So we're going to continue onward and talk about our next bullet item, perceptual organization according to the Gestalt psychological tradition. This is the very smallest nutshell I could come up with for summarizing these principles. Aristotle said the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. In other words, Gestalt psychology is all about how we perceive the entirety of something, the whole of something, rather than a bunch of individual pieces. Let's give a couple examples. If you look at this picture on your left, this painting, it's actually a painting by I believe Arcimboldo is the name of the painter. The first thing that you notice, probably most of us, is that it looks like a face, right? It looks like a man. It kind of looks like he has a beard and has a nose, and he's got hair kind of poking out, a little bit crazy hair. And of course, as we look a little bit closer, we realize, well, his nose is actually a pear, and his mouth is cherries, and his neck is a gourd, and his shoulders are, I don't know, lettuce or something. So the first thing that we notice is a person. And it's only when we look closer that we notice the little individual constituent parts. Similarly, if you look at a clock or a smartwatch or whatever, right, when you look at a clock, you wouldn't see this square shape with a rubberized band, and there's an icon of what seems to be a little white thing, but you pretend you wouldn't know that that's a person running. You look at this, you'd see these hands, and you'd say, well, I see a white thing poking up at one angle, and I see another white thing poking up at another angle, and then there's a strip of pink here and a strip of yellow. And we don't do that. What do? We say, well, it's a clock. We don't break down, according to the Gestaltists, we don't break down things into their little individual components because that's not valuable for us to understand the world. If you walk into the store, you would say, or if you're ordering on Amazon, you'd say, I want a smartwatch. You don't say, yes, please, I would like a device that has a flat, squarish surface, a round, rubberized bracelet that goes around the wrist, and then it has you wouldn't do that. Why? Because it's not useful to you. So Gestalt psychology is all about how do we take this really complex visual world, auditory world, tactile world around us, and how do we organize it into simpler chunks that we can actually interact with, right? That's the whole idea of the Gestalt school. Plus, Gestalt is just a fun word to say. It's a German word that means roughly the entire thing. Gestalt, isn't that fun? So there are a few different Gestalt principles that I think are important for us to become familiar with, not just for understanding perceptual illusions, but to understand humanity and how the human mind works. The first one is called proximity, which, just as the word would imply, it has to do with how close things are to each other. If you look at the stimulus on the left, this stimulus right here, and then you look at the stimulus on the right, this one over here, they have the same number of white rectangles and black rectangles. I know this because I created them both painstakingly, and yes, it was a pain in the rear. They have the same amount of information in them, but we process them in very different ways, and my bet is that if I took these off the screen and asked you to reproduce them as closely as you could on a sheet of graph paper, you would do a really good job of organizing the object on your left and a really poor job of organizing the object on your right. Why? Because we say these things are close to one another. That seems to make sense to me. It looks like a smiley face. And these things over here, they're far away from each other. They don't seem to form any really recognizable pattern. I don't know, they don't seem to go together. That's the idea of proximity. Now, we do this, of course, with visual stimuli in the laboratory, things like these stimuli here, but we also do them in real life. So for instance, if you assume that people who are near each other are together, like are part of a unit, so for instance, I used to ride the bus a lot. I was a poor grad student. I couldn't, like parking on this campus is insanely expensive. And I was like, I don't have money to pay for parking. So what I did was I would ride the bus. And so frequently, I don't know why I didn't learn, but frequently I would get on the bus and I'd see like 3 people all sitting in the back of the bus close together. And then the rest of the bus would be empty. So naturally, I would assume that they were friends traveling together somewhere. And I would frequently be surprised when one person would ring the bell and get off, and then the other 2 would keep riding for several more stops, and then somebody would ring the bell and they'd get off. They just happened to be sitting near each other. So the principle of proximity is when things are close together, we assume that they go together. The second principle has to do with continuity. Now your book has a nice picture of continuity with a stimulus that could either be interpreted as sort of a wiggly sine wave, right, going up and down, and a horizontal line cutting through the midsection of it, or a series of semicircles shifted, offset from one another. So we can do this continuity perception via visual stimuli. So that's really, really common. But I want to show you a second example of continuity using auditory stimuli instead. This one's pretty short. It's less than 20 seconds. All right, so if you need to turn up your volume, but just listen to this. Okay, so now take a moment and read the paragraph just above this little audio clip. It explains what's going on here, right, with this audio clip, but it's basically the same thing as the sine wave with the horizontal line going through it. We perceive an entire phenomenon, right? We perceive that the beep is consistent when the noise pulses, the little static pulses, get loud enough. So we're perceiving something continuous when in reality it's discontinuous. That is the continuity illusion. I should say, let me clarify, because I want to make sure that I'm saying this correctly and appropriately. These aren't necessarily illusions. Like, you can use them to create illusions, so the continuity illusion that we just heard is an illusion. But in most of life, these things are legitimate, correct, useful, not misleading ways of understanding the world. So I should say the continuity principle rather than the continuity illusion. But sometimes you can use them to create illusions. Okay, so the third Gestalt principle that I want to point out is similarity. Have you ever had the experience where you go to Target just to go shopping and you're wearing a red shirt and khakis? Don't. Like, oh my gosh, you will get approached by so many people saying, hey, do you know where the shampoo is? Or can you help me find such and such? It's because you look similar to the other folks who work there. If you go to Walmart wearing a blue shirt and khakis, it's the same thing, right? Or any other store that has a particular uniform that its employees wear. If you dress similarly to that, you should expect that you're going to get approached. So we tend to form similar items into perceptual groups. If they look similar, we group them together. If they sound similar, we group them together. If things taste similar, we group them together. It makes sense, right? We do this all the time because life is really complex. And if I have to treat every single person in a red shirt and khakis as, well, I don't know if that's a Target employee or not, that's much harder for me than if I just make this assumption that they seem similar to what a Target employee should be wearing. The fourth kind of Gestalt principle is called closure. In closure, we perceive a complete form even when it's partly occluded or blocked by other objects, or if part of it's missing. We tend to perceive complete forms and ignore gaps in the border. So this is the symbol, I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with it already. This is the logo for the World Wildlife Federation. What is it? Literally, it's a bunch of blobs put together, but And in fact, if you were to take this black blob over here and kind of move it up and move this black blob over here and pull this one sideways, it wouldn't at all look like a panda. But when it's there in this precise orientation, in this precise set of locations, we perceive a complete form, even though we can't actually see the whole thing. Your mind mentally fills in the gaps to make it seem as though we see the top of the panda, when really we don't. One example of this in real life, this always freaks me out a little bit. I don't know why, it just does. Whenever I'm watching something like Saturday Night Live or a sketch show, something like that, right? So you're sitting there, you're watching the sketch, you know, like at some level of consciousness, you know that this is a set, it is on a stage, it is not a real place, but I get really into the sketches, right? So I'm really paying attention to the characters and their interactions with each other and everything like that. So it always kind of freaks me out when at the end of the sketch, the camera sort of pans out and zooms away, and now all of a sudden, I realize there's no roof on this living room. There's no fourth wall. It always freaks me out because my mind seeks closure. My mind assumes that that fourth wall and that ceiling are there when really they aren't. Now, one thing that's fun about closure is just like with these other principles, we can trick it. We can do illusions. So for instance, this one. There's a whole series of these videos of misleading pictures of just things that make your brain think something that they're not really. So this is one good example of it. So we've talked about these 4 principles of Gestalt organization. I want you to think back to the Kmart commercial we watched at the very beginning of part 1. See if you can think about, and you can pause the video if you want, see if you can think about and figure out which principle or principles of perceptual organization are demonstrated by that Kmart commercial. So if we were in class, I would have you discuss with a neighbor. Since we're not in class, I'll just assume that you paused the video and pondered through it. The correct answer would be the closure. The Ship My Pants commercial is using the principle of closure. Why? Because we perceive in English, right? We perceive that when you hear that set of stimuli, your brain says, well, I know what that person's saying. And we take this top-down approach. We say, I'm going to use my pre-existing knowledge about English phrases and assume that the entire word is there when really it isn't. And then, of course, if you were to slow down the audio track and it'd say, ship my pants, right? Like, of course, if you're going to slow it down, you're going to destroy the illusion of closure, right? So that's, again, like if you took this picture of a baby playing in the sandbox and his mom's butt behind him, if you walked over to the side, it would completely destroy the illusion. So it only works from one perspective generally, and that's true for a lot of these principles. The last principle of perceptual organization that I want to point out, and I will say there are more out there, I'm not going to go over them, and your book doesn't go over them either. But if you're interested and you want to take a class in perception, you will learn a lot more about each of these principles. They're pretty cool. So the 5th one is called figure-ground relationships. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this very famous illusion. It's called faces, vases. So if you focus on the white, you can make it look like it's a fancy vase or a flower pot or something, right? On the other hand, if you focus on the sort of purplish color, you'll note that it looks more like 2 faces looking at each other with their noses almost touching. We use this in real life as well. So figure-ground relationships occur anytime we take our attention, we say, I'm going to pay attention to this and not so much attention to this. This should sound kind of familiar to you based on what we've talked about in the consciousness chapter. So put a pin in that. We use it in real life if we are, for instance, at a concert and we're watching the principal violinist get up and she's doing this amazing solo. Our attention is drawn to that stimulus, that person. partly because she's the only one standing up, partly because she's wearing a fancy dress, partly because everybody else plays more softly, right? Partly because everybody else's attention is on her. All of these factors cue us in to pay attention to this stimulus, this figure. Everything else is the ground. So the other players are the ground, the conductor is the ground, the lights are the ground, the music stands, the chairs, everything else is the ground. So I said, put a pin in the idea that this relates to what we talked about in the consciousness chapter. Here's that pin coming back to us. We've talked about inattentional blindness. We've talked about selective attention. When you focus your attention on something, that is the figure, and everything else becomes the ground. Now you can change what it is that you're focusing on, right? Then that thing becomes the figure, and everything else becomes the ground. So when you're driving along and you're thinking about texting, or you're actually texting, or you're having a conversation with your friend, or whatever, that takes on the highest priority task that you're doing, the figure, and everything else becomes the ground. Now, whether it's that we're driving and texting, or we're, can you walk and chew gum at the same time? We don't have the attentional capacity and the attentional resources to pay attention to everything equally. So what do? We prioritize it. So the thing you're paying attention to, that's the figure. Everything else is the ground. Now the thing is, this happens across all sense modalities, right? So if you are eating something and it's like mostly sweet and there's just like a little bit of sour to it, usually the sour is going to catch our attention. That becomes the figure, the sweetness becomes the ground. We talked about the cocktail party effect. The fact that you're able to focus your conversation, your attention on this thing over here in the room and ignore all of the other chatter, that's a figure-ground relationship. Pain is a very important motivational figure-ground relationship. It's super important for us evolutionarily and biologically to pay attention to pain and to get away from whatever it is that's causing the pain. Pain catches our attention because we are programmed to notice it. That is the figure, and everything else becomes the ground. So think about what must happen for somebody who is in chronic pain, right? What happens is that sometimes what they have to do is they just have to train themselves to purposefully pull their attention away from the chronic pain so that they can attend to anything else. But think about how hard it is when you stub your toe. How hard is it to do anything else for a minute later, right? Now imagine that you have pain like that all the time. Figure ground reversibility was discovered, sort of documented in the 1800s, and it became a really big, fun little trend in the Victorian, sort of the late 1800s, early 1900s. So here's one example. This is called The Death of Vanity. So there were a whole series of these images that were drawn to try to, encourage young people not to be too vain and to think about others and not just spend their lives looking at themselves in the mirror, right? Because this implies if you stare too long at yourself, you're going to just wither away and it's sort of a waste of your life. But again, depending on whether you're focusing on the woman or the skull, you can switch the figure versus the ground. Here's one of my favorite examples. I love this one. Have you ever noticed the arrow in the FedEx sign? If you've never noticed the arrow, look right now for it. Try to find the arrow. It's not a trick. There actually is one in there. If you've seen it before, or if you see it right now, you're going to be like, oh, yeah, well, that's obvious. If you haven't yet seen it, you're probably like, what are you talking about? There's no arrow. Yeah, there is. Here it is. It's highlighted in yellowish green. Let me go back to just the first picture. You can still see the arrow now, right? I've ruined you. I've destroyed your brain. So now every time you see a FedEx truck driving around town, you're going to be like, oh, where's that arrow? Oh, there's the arrow. Right? What I'm doing is drawing your attention to one figure instead of another. Typically, when you look at the FedEx sign, you look at the orange and purple letters. You don't pay attention to the white background until somebody says, hey, pay attention to the white background. Okay, so in order to see how you're doing on this stuff with the Gestalt principles and all that good business, I would like you to, there will be a quiz associated with this, like a little online web link that you can go and complete. Go through these principles and do your best guess to identify what principle it is that it's showing. So the quiz is going to ask you to do that for these 8 questions. So, go complete the quiz, come back, push play, and continue watching the video. Okay, just like we would do in class, we have test yourself questions here in the online video. So this is an example of a question on this stuff that would appear on the exam. So take a few moments, pretend that you're in class, clicking your iClicker. A floating ship is to the ocean water as blank is to blank. So which of these is the best correspondence to that? A, closure and continuity. B, proximity and distinctiveness. C, figure and closure. D, figure and ground. If you need to go back and look at your notes, go for it. But again, remember, on the real exam, you're not going to have your notes. So I encourage you to take these self-testing opportunities as seriously as you possibly can. You ready for the answer? The answer is D. Figure is the floating ship. The ocean water is the ground. Now that isn't to say that it couldn't change, right? But generally speaking, as we're looking out over the ocean, we see a ship. We're like, oh, look, a ship. How exciting. That's super fun and interesting. The other ones don't really fit the question. A, B, and C don't really fit the question, so that is why D is the correct answer. Let's do one more. Once we've formed a wrong idea about reality, we have more difficulty seeing the truth. This best illustrates the impact of, is it A, relative clarity, B, the phi phenomenon, C, top-down processing, or D, visual capture? The correct answer is C, top-down processing. Again, make sure that you are paying attention not just to the questions, but you're paying attention to the answers. If you get it wrong, figure out why. If you're having difficulty figuring out why, see your recitation instructor or see me for additional help.